Tiberius, born in 42 BC and becoming the second Roman emperor in AD 14, reigning until AD 37. As the stepson of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, Tiberius inherited a burgeoning empire. He initially earned favor through his military prowess in Germania and Pannonia, and his service as consul in Rome, but despite his competence as a leader and administrator, his tenure is often marked by his autocratic style and an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that enveloped his later years. His reluctance to wholeheartedly assume the imperial role made him increasingly unpopular among both the population and the Senate, to the point that in AD 26 he withdrew to Capri, distancing himself from Rome and allowing his praetorian prefects to wield significant influence over the empire's governance. His reign saw the advancement of Rome's imperial system, but was also rife with political repression, including the execution of many high-ranking officials under trumped-up charges of treason, actions seen as efforts to consolidate his power. His death in AD 37 remains shrouded in mystery, with some accounts suggesting he was murdered at the instigation of his successor and great-nephew, Caligula. Hello and welcome. We go back to Roman times today. Tiberius. We've not talked about him yet, haven't we? As always, welcome to the newcomers and welcome back to those returning. I hope you're all enjoying the channel. And leave me an insightful comment and perhaps I will pin you up the top so everybody can enjoy. Now, without further ado, let's get on to it, nice and relaxed as always. November 16th, 42 BC. Tiberius Claudius Nero and Livia Drusilla welcomed their child Tiberius into the world. You see, both of the parents, Tiberius Claudius Nero and Livia Drusilla, were part of the prestigious gens Claudia, which was an ancient patrician family that had risen to quite some prominence in the early days of the Roman Republic. Of course, by this time, it had become the Roman Empire. Now, that was his birth name. But you are most likely going to hear the full name referred to as Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. Now, on to his mother, Livia, because she's quite important in the story. She came from the Livii family, which was an old yet quite distinguished plebeian line, into which her father had actually been adopted into. But in 39 BC, Livia divorced Tiberius's father while pregnant and remarried. Now, who was the lucky guy? Well, it was actually Octavian, the later Emperor Augustus. Talk about an upgrade. Well, in 38 BC, Tiberius's younger brother, Nero Claudius Drusus, was born. And by the age of 9, in 32 BC, now we're quite lucky to have a pretty extensive biography from Suetonius, and it mentions quite a lot about the early life, so we'll hear just a little bit from that now. Suetonius writes, "The principal events of his youth and later life, from the assumption of the gown of manhood to the beginning of his reign, were these. He gave a gladiatorial show in memory of his father, and a second in honor of his grandfather Drusus, at different times and at different places, the former in the forum, the later in the amphitheatre, inducing some retired gladiators to appear with the rest by the payment of 100,000 sesterces to each. He also gave stage plays, but without being present in person. All these were on a grand scale, and at the expense of his mother and stepfather. Well, when your stepfather's the emperor, I'm sure you can write a few things off on essential expenses, that's for sure. But certainly not coming from very humble means, are Tiberius. Well, don't let that turn you off, don't worry. Anyway, by 23 BC, when Augustus, the emperor, had become gravely ill, there were these concerns about succession that began to surface, raising fears that his death might actually plunge Rome into civil unrest. Well, historians believe that this illness brought the issue of Augustus' successor to the forefront. Now, although Augustus seemed to hint that Agrippa or Marcellus might succeed him, the question was still up in the air. Tiberius and his brother Drusus were also considered as potential heirs. In 24 BC, Tiberius, who, by the way, at the time was only 17 years old, began his political career under Augustus's guidance, securing the position of quaestor and receiving special permission to stand for the offices of praetor and consul 5 years earlier than the legal minimum age. Similar privileges were granted to his brother Drusus, as both were groomed for significant political roles within the empire. Well, you certainly get away with a lot when your dad is the emperor, or your stepdad at least. Well, subsequently, Tiberius commenced his appearances in court as an advocate, likely marking the onset of his interest in Greek rhetoric, which he was quite enamored with. One can hardly blame him. Well, in 20 BC, some years later, Tiberius travelled east to join up with Augustus, who was out on campaign, you see. The Parthian Empire had earlier seized the standards of the legions commanded by Marcus Licinius Crassus in 53 BC at the disastrous Battle of Carrhae. Also those of Decidius Saxa in 40 BC and Mark Antony in 36 BC. Yes, that is the Mark Antony who threw everybody under the bus by running off to Egypt. Well, following the negotiations with King Phraates IV of Parthia, either Augustus or Tiberius, or perhaps even both of them, successfully retrieved these standards for Rome. Well, Tiberius subsequently commanded a substantial contingent to Armenia, ostensibly to establish it as a Roman client state and mitigate the threat that it posed to the Roman Parthian frontier. Augustus achieved a compromise that resulted in the restoration of the standards, while Armenia was maintained as a neutral zone between the two powers. All in all, pretty successful campaign. Well, it can't all be work, can't it? Tiberius also got married. Congratulations. To Vipsania Agrippina, the child of Augustus's esteemed companion and renowned general, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. He was designated as praetor and dispatched with his legions to support his brother Drusus in the western campaigns. As Drusus concentrated his troops in Gallia Narbonensis and along the German border, Tiberius engaged the tribes in the Alps and Transalpine Gaul, successfully subjugating Raetia, a rather large tribe. In 15 BC, he identified the sources of the Danube and subsequently the curvature of its middle course. The Danube River is, well, it runs through quite a few countries, but if you were going to ask me which country it principally runs through, I'd probably say Romania. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's one of the larger river systems in Europe, Eastern Europe, besides the Volga. Yeah, but we're not going to get into river systems right now. Well, either way, upon his return to Rome in 13 BC, Tiberius had quite a name for himself, and no wonder. So he was designated consul, and approximately his son Drusus Julius Caesar was born. Now the demise of Agrippa in 12 BC enhanced the positions of Tiberius and Drusus regarding the line of succession. At the behest of Augustus in 11 BC, Tiberius annulled his marriage to Vipsania and wed Julia the Elder, Augustus's daughter, who was actually the widow of Agrippa. Poor Vipsania. I wonder if anybody asked her how she felt. Well, Tiberius was exceedingly hesitant to proceed, as Julia had previously pursued him during her marriage. A bit scandalous, while Tiberius was actually content in his own marriage. His new marriage to Julia commenced happily, but subsequently, according to Suetonius, had soured over time. Well, Suetonius asserts that upon encountering Vipsania again, Tiberius pursued her to her residence, weeping and imploring for forgiveness, wanting his old girlfriend back. Oh, you know you can't do that. Subsequently, Tiberius conferred with Augustus, and measures were implemented to guarantee that Tiberius and Vipsania, having trouble with that name, would never encounter each other again. Well, Tiberius, being the golden boy of Augustus, was consistently promoted, and following the deaths of Agrippa and his brother Drusus in 9 BC, he appeared to be the unequivocal candidate for succession. In 12 BC, he obtained military commissions in Pannonia and Germany, both regions characterized by volatility and significant to Augustan policy. Which leads us to 6 BC. Some years later, Tiberius initiated a pincer movement against the tribe of the Marcomanni. It had been quite troublesome for some time. Tiberius, departing northwest from Carnuntum along the Danube with 4 legions, traversed the territory of the Quadi to invade the territory of the Marcomanni from the east. Now, General Gaius Sentius Saturninus would advance eastward from Mogontiacum on the Rhine with 2 or 3 legions, traverse the recently annexed territory of the Hermunduri, and assault the Marcomanni from the west. So the poor old Marcomanni, well, they didn't really stand a chance. Of course, the campaign was highly successful. However, Tiberius was, in the end, unable to really subjugate the Marcomanni, as he was promptly summoned to the Rhine frontier to safeguard Rome's recent acquisitions in Germania. And if you know anything about that area of the empire, you know that it is the most troublesome area to hold. Anything over the Rhine River, very difficult for the Romans, very frustrating. Well, he returned to Rome after this and served as consul for a second time in 7 BC, and in 6 BC he was bestowed with the tribunician power and authority in the east, roles that were previously occupied by Agrippa. Now, in the same year of 6 BC, on the brink of assuming command in the East and becoming pretty much the second most powerful individual in Rome after the emperor, Tiberius declared his withdrawal from politics, and he retired to Rhodes. Seems it was just all too much for him. In fact, the reasons for his withdrawal remain a bit of a mystery. There is a bit of speculation, though. Certain historians have suggested that Tiberius and Drusus were merely intended as placeholders, and would have been displaced once Julia's two sons by Agrippa, Gaius and Lucius, were adopted as heirs by Augustus and reached maturity. Now, once they put two and two together, with a shrug of the shoulders, said, well, screw this, we're going out of here. You can hardly blame them for that. Not going to play into a game that is rigged. Neither should you. Well, this indiscreet and highly visible conduct of his discontented spouse, Julia, may have also contributed. Missing his old wife, and not being too happy with his new one. It's one reason for a grown man to run away from home. Went out for a jar of olive oil and never came back. Well, Tacitus perceived this as Tiberius's fundamental motive for moving to Rhodes, indicative of all of his animosity towards Julia and his yearning for Vipsania. Tiberius, prohibited from seeing this woman that he adored, was wed to a woman he despised and subject to public humiliation due to her indiscretions in the Roman Forum. Well, don't want to say any more about that, don't we? Well, regardless of the motives of Tiberius's withdrawal, he nearly jeopardized Augustus's succession plans. You see, Gaius and Lucius were merely adolescents, while Augustus, at the age of 57, well, he lacked a direct heir. Following his death, the assurance of a tranquil transfer of power all but ceased, as did the certainty that his family and their allies would maintain authority if the role of princeps persisted. There are a few, let's say, melodramatic narratives that depict Augustus imploring Tiberius to remain, begging him, oh, please, even resorting to feigning a grave illness. If you don't go, I will die. Oh, you must stay. One can hardly imagine the emperor doing that, but stranger things have happened. Either way, Tiberius anchored off the coast of Ostia until he received confirmation of Augustus's survival, after which he promptly set sail for Rhodes. Now, allegedly, Tiberius had lamented his departure and sought to return to Rome on multiple occasions, but Augustus consistently denied his petitions. Well, following his exit, succession depended exclusively on Augustus's two grandsons, Lucius and Gaius Caesar. The circumstances grew increasingly precarious in 2 AD, following the demise of Lucius. Augustus, possibly influenced by Livia, permitted Tiberius to return to Rome, but only as a private citizen. No starting any rebellions, please. Well, later in AD 4, Gaius was slain in Armenia, compelling Augustus to once again rely on Tiberius. The demise of his other son Gaius Caesar prompted a surge of activity within Augustus' household. Tiberius was thus adopted on June 26th as the complete son and heir, and consequently he was obligated to adopt his nephew Germanicus, the child of his brother Nero Claudius Drusus, and Augustus's niece Antonia Minor. In conjunction with this adoption, Tiberius was granted tribunician authority and a portion of Augustus's maius imperium, a privilege that even Marcus Agrippa may not have possessed. In AD 7, Agrippa Postumus, the younger sibling of Gaius and Lucius, was repudiated by Augustus and exiled to the island of Pianosa, where he was subject to a rather miserable solitary confinement. Imagine being exiled to some Greek or Italian island, though. It doesn't sound too bad. Well, consequently, in AD 13, when Tiberius's powers were rendered equivalent rather than subordinate to those of Augustus, he effectively became a co-princeps alongside Augustus, ensuring that upon Augustus's death, he could seamlessly assume governance without any interruption or potential turmoil. Pretty much, the paperwork's already done. When the time comes and Augustus walks out the door, Tiberius simply just walks straight in, no questions asked. Well, at this time, of course, he was after a 2-year tenure in Germania. That was from AD 10 to AD 12. Now, Suetonius accounts the situation after this tenure. Tiberius returned and celebrated the triumph which he had postponed, accompanied also by his generals for whom he had attained the triumphal regalia. And before returning to enter the capital, he dismounted from his chariot and fell to the knees of his father, who was presiding over the ceremonies. Since the consuls caused a law to be passed soon after this that he should govern the provinces jointly with Augustus and hold the census with him, he set out for Illyricum on the conclusion of the lustral ceremonies. Now, according to Suetonius, these ceremonies had the proclamation of his co-princeps status occurred in 12 AD, pretty much immediately following his return from Germania. However, when he got back and he discovered that Augustus was in such a horrible state, he devoted an entire day to being with him, which I'm sure Augustus appreciated. No one wants to have those final moments alone. Well, Augustus passed away 19th of August, AD 14. And it was 1 month prior to his 76th birthday, and precisely 56 years after he initially took office as a consul. And that's one long career. And 76 years old? Well, that's a pretty good innings, I think. It's longer than most people lived back then. Longer than some people live right now. Depending on what part of the world you're in. He was cremated, and, with appropriate ceremony as previously arranged, deified. His will was then read and confirmed that Tiberius, who was now 55, as his sole surviving heir. And thus, just like that, as I said, paperwork already done, all signed up, Tiberius walked straight into the role. Nothing complicated, nothing needed to be done, no opposition, no rebellions, no succession crisis. Nope, straight into the role as emperor. It doesn't actually happen too often. Well, the Senate convened on the 17th of September, so almost a month later, to affirm Tiberius's status as princeps, as it had previously been done for Augustus, bestow upon him its authority. Tiberius possessed the administrative and political authority of the princeps, yet he was devoid of the titles of Augustus and Pater Patriae. He declined the civic crown. Similar to Augustus, Tiberius may have endeavored to portray himself as a reluctant yet dedicated public servant, merely an ordinary citizen, striving to serve the state and its populace to the best of his ability and capacity. Unfortunately, not everybody was so keen on the idea. You see, his rejection of these titular, quasi-religious honors and his hesitance to embrace the complete authority of the princeps were actually perceived as affronts to the elite who conferred them, indications of a kind of hypocrisy rather than humility. Tacitus reported that Tiberius scorned the Senate as a, quote, men suited for servitude. I'm sure they didn't like that very much. Now, the antagonism between Tiberius and his Senate appears to have characterized his reign. During his initial years as emperor, you see, Tiberius appeared to desire the Senate to operate kind of independently, without regard to him or his duties as the first senator. His explicit directives were ambiguous, prompting discussions regarding their true implications instead of facilitating the enactment of his legislation. Well, the Roman legions in Pannonia and Germania had also not received the bonuses that were promised by Augustus, exhibiting early indications of mutiny as Tiberius's response remained mute. Where's the money, Tiberius? Well, think about it this way. If you inherit somebody else's debts, let's say that you buy some sort of shop that sells something, and when you buy it, the first week somebody comes in and asks for a refund on something that they bought a month ago, are you inclined to give them a refund? I know that's a little bit off topic, but if agreements were made under Augustus for certain sums of money to be paid for certain services, and Tiberius is now in charge, well, all of a sudden it's not Augustus's money, it's Tiberius's money. Anyway, try and put things into practical modern terms to provide a bit of perspective. So, Drusus Julius Caesar was sent with a small contingent to suppress the insurrection and restore order among the legions. Germanicus assumed the command of the rebellious troops and conducted a brief campaign across the Rhine into Germanic territory, ensuring them that any treasure acquired would serve as their reward. They'll get paid, they just have to go and take it. Germanicus's troops seized all the land between the Rhine and the Elbe. They seized control of the Teutoburg forest, where, yes, that same one where the 3 Roman legions and their auxiliary cohorts commanded by Varus had been obliterated several years prior. They were probably walking over their bodies as they were going through the place. Well, he also retrieved the legionary standards lost in that calamity, preserving them from the humiliation of captivity. These audacious and effective measures elevated Germanicus's already considerable popularity. Upon his return to Rome, he was granted a complete triumph, which he commemorated in AD 17. This was the inaugural complete triumph since Augustus's in 29 BC, so it was certainly a big deal. In AD 18, Germanicus was bestowed authority over the eastern segment of the empire, which was similar to Agrippa and Tiberius prior to him. And this was perceived, by quite a few of them, as an indication of his potential succession to Tiberius. However, it didn't work out, because he died slightly more than a year later. Well, it was alleged that Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria, had poisoned him. But these are just allegations. Let's not lock up poor old Calpurnius just yet. Yeah, he probably poisoned him. Who are we kidding? Well, the Pisones had long been proponents of the Claudians and had formed an alliance with the young Octavian following his marriage to Livia, the mother of Tiberius. The death of Germanicus and the subsequent accusations implicated the new princeps. Piso was tried and, as per Tacitus, threatened to incriminate Tiberius. Well, the government's ability to link the princeps to Germanicus's death remains a little uncertain. Instead of persisting with the trial and the whole show of it amid clear Senate opposition, Piso chose to take the self-checkout line. Well, rest in peace to him. The problem is when you do that, it's seen as an admission of guilt. That being said, if the writing's on the wall, you never know what horrible, torturous fate they have in store for you. Well, AD 22, Tiberius conferred his tribunician authority upon his son Drusus and commenced the annual excursions to Campania, which reportedly extended in duration each year. In AD 23, Drusus perished under enigmatic circumstance, and Tiberius appears to have made no attempt to appoint a successor. Now in 26 AD, some 4 years later, Tiberius relocated to an imperial villa complex he had inherited from Augustus, situated on the island of Capri. It was located just off the coast of Campania, a conventional holiday destination for Rome's elite, especially those who appreciated the cultured and leisured form of life. Well, Lucius Aelius Sejanus had been in the service of the imperial family for nearly 2 decades when he ascended to the position of Praetorian prefect in AD 15. As Tiberius grew increasingly resentful of his role as princeps, he increasingly relied on the restricted secretariat bequeathed to him by Augustus, particularly on Sejanus and the Praetorians. Around AD 17 or perhaps 18, Tiberius reduced the size of the Praetorian Guard, tasked with the city's defense, and relocated it from encampments outside the city walls to within the city itself, thereby granting Sejanus access to approximately 6,000 to 9,000 troops. Now, the demise of Drusus enhanced Sejanus' status, particularly in Tiberius's perception, who subsequently designated him as his socius laborum, which basically means partner of my labors. It's basically a right-hand man. Well, Tiberius commissioned statues of Sejanus to be installed throughout the city, resulting in Sejanus becoming increasingly prominent, as Tiberius pretty much retreated from Rome entirely. Ultimately, following Tiberius' retreat in AD 26, Sejanus assumed de facto control over the entire state apparatus and the city of Rome. He'd pretty much just made himself the emperor. I mean, somebody had to do it. But his role was not precisely that of a successor. A little bit more complicated. You see, he had solicited marriage to Tiberius's niece, Livilla, in AD 25 rather, but he retracted the proposal under duress. Although Sejanus's praetorians governed the imperial communications, thereby regulating the information exchanged between Tiberius and Rome, Livia's presence appears to have temporarily curtailed his explicit authority. Of course, she died in AD 29, and that altered everything. Sejanus initiated a sequence of purge trials, targeting senators and affluent equestrians in Rome, eliminating those who could challenge his authority, while augmenting both the imperial treasury and, of course, his own personal wealth. You gotta take a little bit for yourself, don't you? Well, Agrippina the Elder, who was also the widow of Germanicus, along with her two sons, Nero Julius Caesar and Drusus Caesar, were apprehended and exiled in AD 30, subsequently perishing under pretty mysterious circumstances. During Sejanus's purge of Agrippina the Elder and her family, Caligula, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Drusilla, and Julia Livilia were the sole survivors. Now in 31 AD, Sejanus assumed the consulship alongside Tiberius, who was still absent, and he commenced his serious pursuit of power. Determining the exact events around this that's actually pretty challenging. But it does seem that Sejanus appears to have clandestinely sought to win over families associated with the Julians, and endeavored to ingratiate himself with the Julian lineage to position himself as an adopted Julian, as princeps, or even as potential regent. Livilia was subsequently implicated in this conspiracy and was disclosed to have been Sejanus's paramour for several years. Well, the narrative of this appears to entail their conspiracy to depose Tiberius, backed by the Julians, and either seizing the principate themselves or acting as regents for the young Tiberius Gemellus, or even potentially Caligula himself. Individuals who obstructed him were prosecuted for treason, and then they just killed them all. It's usually the best way of dealing with people who are trying to take your power away in those times. So in AD 31, that same year, Sejanus was called to a Senate meeting, during which they read a letter from Tiberius which denounced Sejanus and mandated his immediate execution. Well, Sejanus was prosecuted, and he, along with several associates, were executed within the space of a week, which just goes to show you how much they didn't like him. I mean, you rush that sort of thing through as quick as possible. No wasting time. Now, I suppose we can stay back after work to sort out the paperwork. Well, after this, he was succeeded as commander of the Praetorian Guard by Naevius Sutorius Macro. Now, Tacitus asserts the additional treason trials ensued, and that while Tiberius had been initially reluctant to take action at the beginning of his reign, by the latter part of his life he appeared to do so with a complete lack of remorse. The families with political connections to the Julians were the most adversely affected. The imperial magistracy was also affected, as well as all individuals connected to Sejanus or linked to his conspiracies, all swiftly tried and even swifter executed, with their assets confiscated by the state. And Tacitus gives us a pretty grim account of what was happening at the time. I quote from Tacitus: "Executions were now a stimulus to his fury, and he ordered the death of all who were lying in prison under accusation of complicity with Sejanus. There lay singly or in heaps the unnumbered dead, of every age and sex, the illustrious with the obscure. Kinsfolk and friends were not allowed to be near them, to weep over them, or even to gaze on them for too long. Spies were set round them, who noted the sorrow of each mourner, and followed the rotting corpses, till they were dragged to the Tiber, where, floating or driven on the bank, no one dared to burn or touch them." Yeah, pretty bad, isn't it? That's if we are to believe Tacitus and take it as gospel. Well, the involvement of Sejanus and the concluding years of treason trials, they didn't do too much for Tiberius's image and reputation. Following Sejanus's downfall, Tiberius's retreat from Rome was total. The empire persisted under the inertia of the bureaucracy instituted under Augustus rather than the guidance of the princeps. Suetonius documents that he developed paranoia and devoted considerable time to reflecting on his son's death. During this period there was a brief incursion by Parthia and assaults on Roman territories by Dacian and Germanic tribes, but they didn't get too far. Of course, minimal efforts were made to strategize or ensure Tiberius's succession. The Julians and their adherents experienced a reduction in both numbers and political clout due to Sejanus, and Tiberius's direct successors were all deceased. Caligula, the only surviving son of Germanicus, or Tiberius's grandson, Tiberius Gemellus, were the potential candidates. Nonetheless, Tiberius made a perfunctory effort towards the conclusion of his life to appoint Caligula as quaestor, thereby conferring some legitimacy upon him as a potential successor, while Gemellus remained merely a teenager, and therefore entirely unfit for several years to follow. Well, Tiberius passed away in Misenum, 16th of March, AD 37, a few months prior to his 78th birthday. Once again, not a bad run. According to ancient sources, though, they don't really concur on the date and location of his demise. There's a few conflicting narratives, especially regarding the specific circumstances. Well, either way, seemed to be quite an atmosphere upon his death. We read from the life of the life of Tiberius by Suetonius rather, about the mood of the day of Tiberius's passing. And, well, it certainly doesn't make Tiberius look very popular. I quote from Suetonius: "The people were so glad of his death that at the first news of it, some ran about shouting, 'Tiberius to the Tiber,' while others prayed to Mother Earth and the mains to allow the dead man no abode except among the damned. Still, others threatened his body with the hook and stairs of mourning, especially embittered by a recent outrage added to the memory of his former cruelty. It had been provided by decree of the Senate that the execution of the condemned in all cases be put off for 10 days, and it charged that the punishment of some fell on the day when the news came about Tiberius. The poor wretches begged the public for protection, but since in the continued absence of Gaius there was no one who could be approached and appealed to, the jailers, fearing to act to the contrary law, strangled them and cast out their bodies on the stairs of mourning. Therefore, hatred of the tyrant waxed greater, since his cruelty endured even after his death. When the funeral procession left Misenum, many cried out that the body ought rather to be carried to Attila and half burned in the amphitheatre, but it was taken to Rome by the soldiers and reduced to ashes with public ceremonies. And just like that is how his life ends. Well, Cassius Dio reports that Caligula, apprehensive of Tiberius's potential recovery before his death, denied the emperor's demands for sustenance, asserting that warmth was paramount over food. Subsequently, with Macro's assistance, he suffocated the emperor with his bedclothes. Oh, it sounds like something that Caligula would do. Well, thank you very much for listening. We reached the end of the life of Tiberius. I'd like to thank my top-tier patrons, Doug, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, and Christine. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening so far. I'll be right back here tomorrow. Somebody said lately that this channel is like a box of chocolates, implying that you don't know what you're going to get. Well, I don't know. Sometimes I just end up doing things that I never thought I'd even really be talking about. But here we are. So I'll see you next time whenever you feel inclined to come back. I'll be here. Good night. Lots of love to you all.